Welcome back to our podcast. Our episode tonight is called Unraveling the Revelation, Part 6. I'm Dale Rude. After Warner's death, he left a tremendous void in the Church of God Reformation movement. This included the development of prophetic-related material and teaching. E. Byram assumed the role of editor of the Gospel Trumpet and became the face of the movement. Brother Byram was not as doctrinally focused as Brother Warner, and that's reflected in his writings. Typically, his books are about issues involving practical life. He did not have a prophetic focus. In 1899, just 4 years after Brother Warner passed away, a split occurred within the Church of God over the issue of sanctification. This resulted in one half of the ministers being removed from fellowship. Under Byram, several changes occurred within the movement, including behavioral practices, which resulted in a sizable split. And more specifically, I'm referring to the necktie. It became a controversy, and Byram settled the issue, and unfortunately, there were those that felt like it was enough of an issue and represented too much change within the movement, and so they left and started another movement, which exists to this very day. However, with all of this, the gap in prophetic teaching would soon be filled, and in a big way. I would like to introduce to you F. Smith. Now, I selected this quote because I think it represents his ministry. Someone had asked him one time, they said, "What advice do you have for a young man? How did you come to your place of responsibility?" And F. Smith replied, "I got in line and I stayed in line." Now, as is the custom of that day, we typically refer to these people by their initials. His full name was Frederick George Smith, and he was born in 1880 and he died in 1947. He was born in Lakota, Michigan, which is up near Grand Junction, Michigan. His parents were Methodist, but they heard the message of the Church of God and they converted in 1883. Their farmhouse became a common meeting place for ministers, particularly since the publishing house existed in Grand Junction, Michigan. So there would be numerous ministers that would come over and visit Brother Warner and the saints in that area, and oftentimes they would be part of the dinner at the Smith house. F. Smith was saved in the fall of 1890. He was about 10 years old, and it was Brother Warner that prayed over him when he gave his heart to the Lord. F. Smith became proficient in shorthand. He began preaching at the age of 18 and was ordained in 1900. He married Bertie Mitchell in March of 1902. After his passing, she would later marry the son of D.S. Warner, whose name was Sidney Warner. Some of F. Smith's accomplishments include the following. He became the chief authority and spokesman for the church historical interpretation of prophecy applied to the Church of God. He became the personal secretary of E. Byram. He was a very talented writer. He was a lecturer, and he was the first person that used large charts to explain prophetic symbols within the Church of God. He was the third editor of the Gospel Trumpet Company. He was a preacher and a missionary, and later in life he became a pastor at the McKinley Avenue Church of God in Akron, Ohio. He pastored there for 15 years. Smith wrote a number of books. His first book was published in 1908, titled The Revelation Explained. And as I said, this book and others are very common in most Church of God homes. A few years later, he printed the first edition of What the Bible Teaches. And by 1955, this book had sold over 100,000 copies. In 1919, he published the book called The Last Reformation. And as you can imagine, this book was basically laying out the picture of the Church of God being the last Reformation before the second coming of Christ. In 1924, he published a book called The Heart of the Money Problem. And many believe that this was the first sanctioned book that introduced the concept of tithing. Prior to this, the Church of God had been anti-tithing. In 1941, he wrote a book called Prophetic Lectures on Daniel and the Revelation. In 1911, he wrote a book entitled Evolution of Christianity. 1915, after a missionary journey, he wrote a book called Missionary Journeys Through the Bible Lands. In 1920, he wrote a small booklet called The Gift of Tongues, What It Is and What It Is Not. This book contains a few statements that probably would not be accepted among some of the Church of Gods today, particularly in the Seventh Seal movement. In 1926, he wrote a small booklet called Brief Sketch of the Origin, Growth, and Distinctive Doctrine of the Church of God Reformation. I mentioned already that Brother Smith used charts when explaining the Revelation. He was very widely in demand within the Church of God and traveled frequently giving these lectures and selling his books. I'm going to read you a quote from John W.V. Smith, no relation to F.G. Smith that I know of, and this is found in the book called Heralds of a Brighter Day. He, F.G. Smith, was never without advance bookings for delivering a series of lectures on Daniel and Revelation, which portrayed the church in prophecy. He had some large charts prepared, which, when displayed in a medium-sized building, would usually cover the entire front and parts of the walls on each side. It took him 8 nights to go through the entire series. He amazed audiences with his ability to go through the entire complicated series involving a countless number of details without reference to a manuscript or notes. He later wrote up these in much the same form as they were given. They were published in 1941. Of the book titled The Last Reformation, it contains the following. The final Reformation is on. Final, quote unquote, I say because it leaves nothing to be restored as regards either doctrine, practice, or spirit. It stands committed to the restoration of the whole truth and the harmonious unity of the church, of all true Christians in one church-ruled, spirit-filled body. This book contains this particular chart that shows the same 4 church ages that had been taught by Brother Warner, but also included references throughout the scripture for each individual church age: the apostolic period, the medieval period, the era of modern sects, the last Reformation. Warner typically called these the early morning church, the Dark Ages, the Protestant age, the dark and cloudy age, and then finally the evening light. In the book Prophetic Lectures on Daniel and Revelation, it contains copies of the charts that Brother Smith used, which are shown on the left-hand side of your screen. These were charts that showed the beast back in Daniel, described them, and also talked a little bit about the political environment that existed and different types of governing methods that was used in the political world. On the bottom, it shows additional charts, including the chart on the right-hand side that we've already seen before in our podcast, that was expanded on a little bit in F G Smith's book. Here's a picture that shows 4 strips of symbols of the various series in Revelation. These were also included in that book. In 1916, F. G. Smith became the editor of the Gospel Trumpet paper. He held that position until 1930. I believe it was his first issue that I have shown here that was dated June 15, 1916. And on the left-hand side, he had some words that explained his burden and what his commitment to God and to the church regarding the magazine. Once again, you can go to the Nicholson Library in Anderson, Indiana at their website and go to Archives, and you can download copies of the Gospel Trumpet, including this particular copy. Now, this picture here was taken in 1923 in Springfield, Ohio, where I grew up. In this picture, there are a number of ministers, actually all of these are ministers, that had attended the camp meeting there. And F. G. Smith, I believe, is one of the individuals here. The screen is too small, and I can't pick him out here in this particular picture. But he attended camp meetings in Springfield. In fact, I have pictures of him and his wife there on the campgrounds. On the right-hand side, you will see invitations that were usually used whenever Brother Smith would be coming for a revival, and this is just a typical announcement that would be sent out. I'll read the bottom of it just for interest. Dr. Smith has given these lectures completely around the world and has become famous as an authority on prophetic interpretation. Revelation, the mystery of the book of the Bible, is made plain, unalterable laws of symbolic language, and the use of his great array of artistic charts. And this would be sent out as an invitation to attend the meeting. Now, this was the chart that Brother Smith used. This chart is over in the archives at the Church of God, and it may be the first chart pictorially that was used within the Church of God. At least that is my belief. Over on the left-hand side, you see, again, the image that we've discussed before, and the beast of Daniel. And then you see Jesus being baptized and the Spirit descending upon him. Below you see the dragon of pagan Rome. And then you also see the 4 time periods, although they're not quite as distinguished as in previous charts. But you have what he called the apostolic period from AD 30 until 270. Then you have the papal age, which lasted 1260 years up until 1530. Then you have the Protestant era, which lasted 350 years to 1880. And then finally, you have the last Reformation, or the evening light. And this is a very interesting chart. I've studied it extensively, and I use this actually in other presentations that I give. So I really like this chart, and I'm thankful that it was able to be preserved and digitized. Let's talk real briefly about the Revelation Explained. As you recall, this was one of the first books, and in fact it was the first book that was published and written by F.G. Smith. Now, it was actually written around 1906 or so and published in 1908. F.G. Smith was about 25 years old while writing this book. This book had a major revision in 1945 and included some quotes by a man called John Cumming. The revision did. Now, F.G. Smith, he said about this revised book, this is what he had to say. So as you can see there, it went from 1908 to 1945, and there were revisions that took place all along. But in 1945, it was not radically, but it was changed in a major way. This is what he had to say. 37 years of experience in dealing with the subject enables the author to improve the original. It is the difference between a boy of 25 and a man of 62. John Smith said in his book titled Heralds of a Brighter Day, he, F.G. Smith, presented strong evidence that the Church of God was not just another church sprung into being. It was an essential aspect of God's total scheme for the church and for history itself. Now, I mentioned John Cumming. Let's talk real briefly about him. He was born in 1807 and lived until 1881. He was a clergyman with the Church of Scotland, and he published approximately 180 books during his lifetime. He held to the church historic interpretation, as did the Church of God. He held to the interpretation of end times teaching and was said to be obsessed with eschatology. He believed that historical events such as the French Revolution and the Great Famine of Ireland had been prophesied in Daniel and Revelation. Now, John Cumming held very similar views as did the Adventists of his day, and was one of the most prolific figures of his time to hold anti-Catholicism views. In fact, Ellen White was known to have quoted him in at least one of her books, and I have the reference for that. So he was, as you know, the Adventist Church was not established in those early years, but he must have had some connection, or they had some connection with him, and there was this shared view of the church historic interpretation, and that Jesus was soon coming back. In fact, John Cumming preached that the sixth vial of the judgment had been poured out in 1820, and taught that Judgment Day would occur sometime between 1848 and 1867. So once again, we have someone who was predicting, based on prophetic measurements of time, that the Judgment Day would happen a little later than what the earlier Adventists had been saying. Now, why do I bring him up? I'm going to tell a little story here. I used to visit with Brother Danny Layne back in the 80s and 90s. And I was out at his place one time out in California, and he had a library, and we shared, obviously, interest in Church of God background and Church of God literature. And he showed me this book. It's called Lectures on the Book of Revelation. And it was written by John Cumming in 1856. And Brother Layne told me, he said he had acquired that book as well as some other books from F.G. Smith's personal library at their local bookstore. They knew he had an interest in books, and so they got some books that came in to their store, and they called him. And he came down, and I understand he bought quite a few of them there. But this was one of the books, and so you can see on the right-hand side Brother Layne's name at the top, and then F.G. Smith's name where it's stamped. And so this was a book that was in F.G. Smith's personal library. Now, Brother Layne told me that there was a lot of information that was gleaned from this book that got included in F.G. Smith's book. And he said there was a substantial amount of information that got included, and he even used the word plagiarized. Now, I don't think that was an accusation that he was making in a legal sense, but he was just noting that there was a lot of information that F.G. Smith had gleaned from John Cumming. So I got those books, and I got my own copy of this, and I was looking at the differences, and sure enough, I did find very similar, in some cases word for word, passages that had been used in this book that were used in F.G. Smith's book. Now, in F.G. Smith's early edition of his book, it was not noted that they were from John Cumming, but in later revisions, including that later revision that we just discussed, F.G. Smith did give Cumming credit for the work. So here is another connection to the Adventist movement that sprang up, and it shows itself in the writings of F.G. Smith. Now, I want to take a real quick look at some of the charts in a bigger way so you can see them a little bit better. This is a chart that was used by F.G. Smith. I believe this one is in the Revelation Explained. And there's a big picture there of that chart that we saw earlier, and here it is again shown. Now, one of the things I noticed right away is that it talks about Mohammedanism. So some of the other writings, there really wasn't anything about Mohammedanism, and they believe that there was a connection early with the Prophet Muhammad and his exposure to Christian literature or the Bible. Also, another thing you notice is that there's a reference to the Orthodox Church. This is kind of unusual, particularly in our teaching today, because typically we don't talk about the Orthodox Church. I mean, there's a beast that's assigned to the papacy or the Roman Catholic Church. There's a beast that came up out of the earth that's assigned, if you will, to or represents Protestantism. But there is no beast that describes the Orthodox churches. And actually the Eastern churches, there are more Eastern Church Christians of Orthodox teaching than there are even Protestants. That's just an observation. But once again, though, we see the four periods laid out here on this particular chart: the apostolic period, the papacy, the Protestantism, and then the true church restored of the evening light. You might have seen this chart before. This is a diagram explaining in detail the prophecies going clear back, and then also showing how the church progressed. Now this is, again, the 4 time periods, but it's just shown more in a manner that gives more words than it does pictures. And finally, here's a chart that talks about the civil and the political events that's described. Again, we don't talk too much about the political side of these things in our more modern teaching. And then finally, here's a chart that kind of shows the 7 series that we talked about and where they fit within the overall book of Revelation. Okay, let's talk, as we're moving forward in our study, we're going to be getting into the 7 seal church movement. So I wanted to point out a few things that Brother Smith had mentioned in his book, in the Revelation Explained. This is what he had to say. The future, doubtless, will witness a still greater development of this subject. For men of God, more worthy and possessing greater abilities, will arise, who, beginning where we have left off, will continue its investigation and throw upon it additional light as yet unrevealed. That the Lord will bless the Revelation Explained to the good of the church upon earth and grant it a place, however small, in the cause of the present truth is my earnest prayer. Now, I labeled this the loophole. Why did I label this the loophole? Because basically what Brother Smith was saying was, here is a presentation of the information as I understand it. But there's some areas that I don't have clarity. And so he says it will be doubtless in the future that there will be others that will pick up where he had left off and continue on in their understanding as God would reveal light to them. And that's pretty much what happened. Specifically of the silence in heaven, F.G. Smith wrote, upon the opening of the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven about the space of half an hour. Whether this interval of silence is intended to be symbolical of any event on earth, I do not know. Neither have I seen any solution of the matter that is consistent or satisfactory. He went on to say, its explanation would seem to be found in connection with certain facts stated respecting the opening of the preceding seals, that voices followed them. When the first 4 seals were opened, John heard the voices of 4 beasts, quote, as it were a voice of thunder, unquote. And on the opening of the 5th, he heard the souls of the martyrs crying unto God. But when the 7th was opened, there was silence for a time. The contrast is notable, but whether it has any special signification, I am unable to say, perhaps not. We're going to talk more about the silence in heaven and the opening of the 7th seal in our future podcasts. I also want to point out that Brother Warner in his writings, and I am going to share this later on, but Brother Warner in his writings would give explanation for the first 6 seals, and he would even refer to the 7th seal. But I've searched through all of his writings, and I never found anything that described or even talked about the events of the 7th seal. And so there does seem to be a gap there in understanding between where they were at that time and where those that followed them picked up. So that concludes our episode. Thank you for your attention.